everyone, welcome. I'm Diana Martin. I'm the Executive Director here at Hourglass, and I would like to welcome you all to today's First Friday Forum on the Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith Center for History and Democracy, which will be coming to downtown Lancaster in 2025. This project has been more than 20 years in the making, which we'll hear a little bit more about today. Today we're joined by Tom Ryan, President and CEO of Lancaster History, and Robin Sarratt, who is the Vice President of the organization and who's leading the project team for the new center, to learn about the incredible journey that has been creating this center, including an over $20 million fundraising campaign. Today we're going to get a sneak peek of some of the exhibits and learn more about what visitors can expect to experience. So after the talk, we'll have some time for questions from all of you and also the folks joining us virtually on the live stream. If you're on the live stream, if you drop your questions in the chat, I will keep an eye on them. So thank you all so much for being here. I want to thank our First Friday Forum sponsors, Rogers & Associates, and also Millersville University and the Ware Center for hosting us today. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our presenters and excited to learn more. Thanks.
Go sit over there so you can see this.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to come and present on a project that, as Diana mentioned, has been a long time in the making. There are a lot of familiar faces here in the room. There are a lot of folks who are in the trenches and have been in this particular trench for some time, so it's great to have you come out and see this kind of update on where things are going, and I can tell you they're going well. The presentation today will be in three parts: the place, the people, and the project. I'm going to introduce the first two, the place, the place and the people. Robin will delve into the project, which is frankly much more exciting than the first two parts that I'll cover. The story is familiar to many of us in this room, but perhaps not all, and so especially if you weren't around 25 years ago, some of this might not be so familiar. So let's take a little bit of a look at the past just to get a sense of the project. Okay, here we are. Fortunately, David McNeely Stauffer, a local artist in the second half of the 19th century, captured this view with his ink and pen of the former home of Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith. Now, it was originally a 1.5-story building that was later expanded. By the time Stevens moves in, it's been enlarged to 2.5 stories and pretty much appeared as you see it here. To the right, you see a 2-story property that is the Kleist Brewery at the time that Stevens moves in, and when at the time he purchases the property, and when he purchases it, the house, he also purchases the brewery and the property that extends behind it. The brewery at the south of the house, where the Kleists ran their establishment, is seen here in this 1873 Sanborn insurance map, fire insurance map. So the quick code here is if it's in red, it's brick. If it's in yellow, it's framed or wood. If it's in blue, and you see one blue up there, it's in stone. And then the buildings are insured based on the likelihood that they might burn. So the more brick and stone you have, the better you were. This is how the home appeared around 1970. When historic preservationist and specialist John Snyder, someone near and dear to many of us in this room, completed a report on the property as part of a citywide, in fact, it was a countywide historic preservation series that the Historic Preservation Trust conducted. But you can see at the time, the left portion of the building was an auto mechanic repair. So the front parlor and the rear parlor had been turned over to that purpose. On the right-hand side, there was a small restaurant, and above, on the 2 floors above, it was boarding house and apartments for rent. Notice John's astute observation, it may be noted that Stevens' historical importance is better appreciated nationwide than it is in his own hometown. 20 years later, up at the center square, the Bonton announces its plan to close, leaving a gap in the very heart of the city and bringing an end to a more than a century-old shopping establishment. Penn Square Partners is formed and a convention center plan is hatched, but the Stevens and the Kleist buildings are not part of that plan. In fact, they're threatened with demolition. As preparations for the convention, can you see anything, or should I pull back a little bit here? Okay. As preparations for the convention center proceeded, a team of archaeologists led by Jim Dell, now associated with the Historic Preservation Trust, I think he may be their vice president or vice chair, and Marianne Levine, Jim is at Millersville University, Marianne at Franklin and Marshall College, undertook investigations unearthing a pair of cisterns as well as many, many objects. And the cisterns contained elements that led to a hypothesis that these spaces may have been used to harbor freedom seekers who had escaped from slavery. There were other instances known and documented of cisterns being used in this purpose right here in Lancaster County, but in more rural parts. Though the evidence is somewhat inconclusive as to whether or not the cisterns actually harbored escaped slaves, the public reaction galvanized tremendous support for saving the structures as both an historic place but also an interpretive center, a place to explore Underground Railroad activity in Lancaster County. Eventually, a documented case of Underground Railroad activity involving one Oliver Cromwell Gilbert and his companions surfaced and confirmed Stevens' involvement in Underground Railroad activity. The National Park Service, as a result of that, based on that evidence, approved the property as an official site on the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. And based on that evidence, I want to go one more? Right. The Lancaster County Convention Center Authority and the Historic Preservation Trust, represented in this image by the indomitable Margot Brubaker, a fierce advocate for its preservation and its development, reached an agreement to accommodate the site into the floor plans and the plans for the convention center. By 2007, plans are well underway for the construction of the convention center. And here you see on the far left the Lydia Smith properties. So the far left edge of the picture, you're on Christian Street, the alley that kind of takes you down from Telus 360. You go down Vine and you see in the second arrow the Kleist on the left, and then the Stevens and Smith property and law office to the right, and then further down the William Montgomery House, also incorporated into the project. And you see kind of a hollow shell of the Watt and Shan department store from the back end. The hard-fought efforts of the Historic Preservation Trust really resulted in a masterful restoration of these exteriors. If you recall from the earlier picture, the Stevens Smith house was 3 full stories. That top story was taken off. The roof and dormers were reestablished. Also preserved is the Kleist building to its right, and then around the corner, the 2 rental properties that Lydia Hamilton Smith owned. Not only were the exteriors beautifully restored, but the structural integrity of the buildings was secured for future development. By 2009, that phase was completed, again to the enormous credit of the Historic Preservation Trust and its very generous contributors, some of whom are in this room. HPT then looked to Lancaster History for assistance to complete the project. I think in some instances the organization realized their core mission was that of advocating for preservation and not so much establishing a museum or an entity. And so they looked to us to see whether or not we would be supporters of this project, and we said yes. But of course, that was 2010, and so you might ask, well, why in 2023 are we just talking about this? That's a 13-year hiatus. At the time, we had just merged with President Buchanan's Wheatland, the Historical Society in Wheatland, and we had agreed also to take on the collections of the Heritage Center Museum and the former Lancaster Quilt and Textile Museum. Our plates were pretty full. To meet the needs of those new acquisitions, we had engaged in a $13 million capital expansion project at Lancaster History to accommodate all that change. And we had to give our benefactors who were supporting that $13 million project a chance to pay their pledges down over 3, 5, in some cases 10 years, catch their breath, and then we'd come back to them to talk about the Stevens and Smith. So that would take us up to about 2020. In June 2019, we launched the planning process to complete the Stevens and Smith Center. Robin will fill you in on that process in part 3. But first, part 2, the people. In 1842, Stevens moved to Lancaster and set up his law practice. He takes lodgings at the Fountain Inn on South Queen Street, which was pretty much right where the museum had been for LNP, those large glass, pane glass windows with the history of the Lancaster newspapers behind it. He rented a townhouse there from Adam Reigert, and he allowed the Clace family to continue to run the brewing operation, and they were living in the house that he would eventually occupy. He hired Lydia Hamilton Smith, an acquaintance from Gettysburg, as his housekeeper, and she moved to town with her 2 sons, leaving behind what may have been an abusive relationship in Harrisburg. Stevens, born in northern Vermont, pretty hard-scrabble area, born with a club foot, had a brother with 2 club feet. His father had left the family sometime around 1806 or 7, not exactly sure. And his mother was left with, I think it's 4 children, thank you, and a farm to run. But keep in mind, 2 of her children are not capable of a lot of heavy physical labor, so it's a bit of a predicament. And she early on sets her sight on their education as probably their only pathway to success because of their physical challenges. He goes to Peacham Academy, eventually University of Vermont, and graduates from Dartmouth, moves then to York County because he has a friend there, and he hears of a teaching job. So he comes to teach ostensibly, but I think he's really here to study law and open up a legal practice. Politically, he starts to become involved at the state level, at the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. He's a key factor. He's really the leader of the fight to preserve free public education in the Commonwealth. And he succeeds in turning his opponents around on the issue. They had approved it. The farmers and other folks didn't like the taxes that it was taking out of their pockets to educate poor children. And there was a big revolt against it. But he managed to turn that around and preserve it. In 1837, the Commonwealth wrote a new constitution. Prior to that constitution, blacks voted. In this constitution, they were expressly prohibited from voting. Stevens adamantly fought against this new constitution. He eventually voted against it because of that provision. And then in 1848, he's elected to Congress. So let's read this quote. It's a little cumbersome. It's in that kind of mid-19th century language. When I reflect how apt hereditary wealth, hereditary influence, and perhaps as a consequence, hereditary pride are to close the avenues and steel the heart against the wants and the rights of the poor, I'm induced to thank my Creator for having, from early life, bestowed upon me the blessing of poverty. It's not too often that we think about the blessings of poverty, unless perhaps if you're in religious life and you've taken a vow. So Stephen has linked his early poverty to his defense of the rights of the poor, especially the right to a free public education, because he sees, in fact, he knows the pathway to true freedom and a robust democracy is a good education. And in this, he implicitly chides people of means, people with resources, for stealing their hearts against the needs of the poor. Lydia. She's born in a tavern outside of Gettysburg, marries Jacob Smith, moves to Harrisburg, has 2 children, William and Isaac, eventually comes to Lancaster in 1844 to work for Stevens. She's his house manager, she's a close confidant, but frankly, and we'll go on to hear a little bit more about this in a few minutes, she keeps the man alive, according to his doctor, for probably 8 years longer than he would have lived had she not cared for him as she did. In those 8 years is when these remarkable constitutional amendments passed, the 1866 Civil Rights Act, so she's a pretty important figure. And there'll be a biography on her coming out in November this year, co-published by Lancaster History and Penn State Press, written by Dr. Mark Kelly, and I hope you'll look forward to that. So Smith lived at a time when women, in particular women of color or mixed race, had few legal protections or guaranteed rights. Yet she managed to exercise many of the social, civil, and political rights associated with full citizenship. Before and after the Civil War, she bought and sold property. She traveled freely. She filed lawsuits in court and testified against whites. She worked profitably in several different fields. She socialized with prominent white and black families, not just in Lancaster, but in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. And all this without actually being a citizen of the United States. While working and living together, and this is kind of an intricate map, it's not the easiest one to read, but it kind of gets at the Underground Railroad networks in the area. While working and living together, Stevens and Smith shared a house, the care of 4 young men, Smith's 2 sons, and Stevens' 2 orphaned nephews, and the responsibility that came with furtively assisting freedom seekers using the Underground Railroad. Stevens assisted these seekers from his home in Lancaster in the 1840s and 50s. Meanwhile, his Caledonia Iron Works in Adams County was a place of work and refuge for many formerly enslaved, and he was known to pay anti-slavery spies to keep an eye on the bounty hunters in the area and inform him of fugitives in need of assistance. In an 1847 letter, Stevens warned a neighboring farmer that the man-stealers of Lancaster have taken measures to obtain authority from Maryland to arrest and take into slavery 2 colored girls who lately lived with you and your brother. He urged the man to help the former slaves free to Canada. And then he explained, although the slaveholders have agents and spies, he had a spy on the spies, and thus ascertained the facts. Stevens concluded the note saying, "These are the 8th set of slaves I have warned this week." Stevens was among the most influential political and constitutional actors during the Civil War and the crucial first few years of Reconstruction. He was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. The House Ways and Means Committee controlled the purse of Congress. This is kind of an apt time to think about the purse of Congress. And Lincoln could virtually move nothing forward without Stevens' support, because that's where the payment would come from. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, Smith's nursing was essential to maintaining his health long enough to shepherd through Congress and into law the 13th and the 14th Amendments, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Stevens died in '68, just before the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote, was passed, but he was very instrumental in its creation, its construction, and kind of moving it through the political process. According to Stevens' physician, Dr. Carpenter, who incidentally was also James Buchanan's physician, Stevens' life was prolonged 6 or 8 years by her faithful nursing. Without Smith at his side, Stevens would not have lived long enough to lead the nation through Reconstruction. He left Smith a bequest of $5,000, about $90,000 in today's value. More than he left to any other individual, except for a nephew, his ward, Thaddeus Jr. Before his death, he arranged for his burial in Shriner Cemetery in Lancaster, which he chose because it permitted blacks and whites to be buried together. As this epitaph explains, "I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules. I have chosen this, that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated throughout a long life, equality of man before his creator." Smith's name appears in more than a dozen property purchases and sales, beginning with a small home she bought from Stevens in Gettysburg as a rental property while she was living in Lancaster in 1852. In 1871, she purchased from Stevens' estate the house at 4547 Queen that she shared with him for over a decade, paying $7,320. She reserved 2 rooms for herself in that house to use when she was back in Lancaster: Thaddeus Stevens' bedroom and the private library next to it on the 2nd floor, and rented out the remaining rooms. She also remained in Washington, D.C. most of the time after Stevens' death, purchasing and operating a successful 4-story boarding house across the street from the landmark Willard Hotel, which newspapers described as genteel lodgings for gentlemen. Smith opened a second boarding house in Philadelphia in 1875, just in time for the various colored conventions and the centennial celebrations in 1876. Smith's property ownership, I think I have another, property ownership, I'll find my space here, indicates that she was one of only 3 women of color to own property in Lancaster County in the mid-19th century. She left behind her surviving son, many friends and admirers, and a sizable estate, which she doled out to friends and associates through bequests, many known to be Underground Railroad operatives and open abolitionists throughout the United States, published her obituary and described in detail the memorial service in Washington, D.C., and her funeral in Lancaster. She's buried at St. Mary's Cemetery beside her son, William. Sadly, Isaac, her other son, died the same year and is buried beside her. Now I'll turn it over to Robin to talk about the project.
Thanks, Tom. I bet everybody does this, where they point at the screen, even though the computer's actually right here. Thank you for the introduction. And everyone is always a little nervous when we start telling a story that is essentially 225 years in length and we have a slideshow. The good news is I'm going to pick back up where Tom left off in 2010. And we're going to get very closely fast-forwarded to the current moment. But just to follow up on what Tom was saying, when we took property responsibility for this project, we didn't just let it sit static. We continued forwarding the project in different ways, hosting symposia, writing books, supporting research opportunities, creating exhibitions, hosting programs, lectures. We did an installation at the train station to introduce newcomers to who Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Smith were. So we've really taken seriously the responsibility of making sure that the story stayed alive in the intervening decade between when we said yes to it and when we would be in a position to go ahead and begin moving forward. It's a complex project, and we're really honored to have the opportunity to tell these stories, and not just of Stevens and Smith. Certainly, these are our two key characters. But as you'll see in some of the renderings that I'm going to show you, this is also about a vast network of individuals who are committed to the cause of abolition, of civil rights, of simply being good neighbors to people who needed assistance. And so the story we'll tell at this center is going to be much broader than our two key characters. It really is going to be a story about this community as well as anything else. So now we get to fast forward to about the present moment. We knew by 2020 we were going to be responsible for taking this on and fully fleshing it out. And so we went ahead and applied for some assistance so that we could do it right. We were very fortunate to have strong support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which in our world is sort of the good housekeeping seal of approval. The High Foundation got on board very quickly to also support efforts to ensure that we went through a robust process of community engagement, to have conversations with neighbors, community leaders, folks who have been committed to this story a lot longer than the 20 years. The Community Foundation got on board early as well to make sure that we had the bridge funding in place to carry the community engagement process forward from the summer of 2019, when we started it, straight through the COVID years, and until we could get additional funding in place. So what you see here is one of a number of sessions that we hosted where we really saw input and feedback on what people would hope and like to see in this center when it was developed. The other thing our funding enabled us to do early was consult with a very smart group of people. We recognized the significance of this national story, and so wanted to make sure we brought the right people to the table so that it was told effectively. There are a number of ways we're going to measure our success at this project. In my mind, one of them will be that a random scholar will walk in off of the sidewalk and come out and say they did this right. And scholarship is changing all the time. So bringing to the table a group of 25 top-of-the-field experts in American history, the history of political science, biographers of Stevens, experts on Underground Railroad, museum field experts. This was really critical as we started pulling together both a master plan for how the business piece of this would come together, but importantly at this moment, the interpretive plan. And what the interpretive plan allowed us to do was walk into a design process informed. So we took advantage. We won't say that the COVID lull was what we hoped for in our planning process, but we did take advantage of the moment and went through a very carefully orchestrated proposal process. We issued an RFP to 30 well-regarded exhibition design firms across the nation, and we received 13 proposals back. We interviewed 4 firms. Any one of them would have been a remarkable selection. The team we ended up with is Ralph Applebaum Associates. And if you've been to a museum, not only in the United States in the last couple of decades, internationally, you've stepped inside their work. Most notably, that first slide I showed was of the new Smith, it's not that new anymore, it's now going on 10 years, but the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. They were the design team behind that entire site, not to mention museums, 700 commissions in 50 countries. So this is a really skilled, smart team of people. To our hopes and dreams, they also came with our vision fully intact. They understood it from the outset. They are committed to our shared commitment of diversity throughout this project. And none of you are here for business pointers from me, but I'll just give you this question that we ask in every interview process. We're going to spend a lot of time with these people, so we made sure to ask them if they're fun. And they really are. And it really is important. You think about how you're going to commit yourself to something like this. We are in the weeds with these people day in and day out. And so having a degree of trust, not only that they understand the vision of the project, but that they understand our organization, our staff, and our community was really important to us. One of the things that RAA signaled early on was a commitment to an inclusive design process. And that matters to us for 3 key reasons. The first has to do with our people. So back to Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens lived with a club foot, He lived with a disability. He was in pain much of his life. His brother also struggled through the same experience. So from the outset, we knew we needed this project to be one that felt inclusive and accessible to anyone at any time, that all abilities would be considered. Second reason is that experience is shared by 61 million Americans. So 25% of all adults at some point will live with a disability. So making sure that we have a comfortable and engaging experience for everyone who wants to go to a history museum is pretty crucial. And third, it's pretty simple. If something is accessible to people who are living with a disability, it's accessible to the rest of us. I mean, how many of us are in here trying to take our glasses on and off every time we walk into the grocery store, much less a museum where you're actually there to read things? You want to make sure you have a comfortable experience. And what we were able to do, thanks to a $250,000 grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, is hire this company, Prime Access Consulting, to go soup to nuts with us through this entire project and make sure that accessible design is in very simple ways and fairly complicated ways incorporated into what we're planning. So some of these things are pretty straightforward: color contrast, font size, a zone of accessible reading so that you're not looking up, you're not trying to bend down. You can really access the core information in a simple and straightforward way. Things like font size. How closely do you have to stand to the wall? What's the lighting level like? How comfortable are you while you're there? And then taking into consideration some very specific aspects. So we want this to be an experience that the visually impaired community can really enjoy fully. There'll be everything from the basics of size and scope. Tactile warning strips are just simply the dots, the raised dots on the floor, so you know when you're about to go into a new space. But we're learning a lot. I had no idea that there were tactile QR codes that can lead somebody to know that they can enact a system that will provide refreshable braille to a device that they bring with them. So these things are not hard to integrate into a project if you do it from the outset. And we're really grateful to have such great guidance from the team, Prime Access Consulting, that's working with us. Stramps, by the way, is a new word in our team. Stramps are when you combine a stair and a ramp unnecessarily. Just put in a ramp. You don't need the stairs. So this is where we get in the fun pictures. And I'm starting, the segue here between accessibility and this particular rendering is intentional. If you were to walk right now over to the Stevens and Smith site and you start at the square and you go down Queen Street, you're going to go by 7 entrances that exist in the current architecture. None of them are accessible. And so rather than have one front door for people who walk upstairs and another front door for people who don't, we're going to create an entirely new entrance that doesn't exist, that's going to be a little bit complicated. But this is on Vine Street. So essentially, if you know where the Commons on Vine lobby is right now, there are 3 plate glass windows adjacent to it on the sidewalk. We're going to take those windows out and put our entrance in there. There's already a ramp. There's already a bus drop-off. It's already a really convenient spot to host people. And so your experience will begin in the center through this lovely entrance. And for those of you who haven't spent time in this lovely poured concrete cavern, Ernie Schreiber is on one of our committees, and I don't know how many tours you've been along with us, but he can tell you it's still dusty. This is its current state. This is actually looking at the back of Stephen's home, and the law office is just off to the screen side. But that little door in the back is into the basement of Stephen's home. And this is one of our visions for what it can become. So right now, we're all standing in the Vine Street entrance, and we're going to be walking over this lovely new ramp, which will have a combination of materials, including some glass portals. And those will allow you to look down into that excavated cistern that Tom mentioned. It's an intentional opportunity for us to begin visitors' experiences with this degree of inquiry. Why is this here? Why did we go through the exercise of preserving these old wells? What stories do they have to tell us? What am I about to experience at this center that's going to be different than other museums? By the time you've arrived on this overlook, you've sort of just had a chance to take in the entire scope of the space. And then we're going to spend time in our first 4 rooms really orienting you to the 4 kind of key fundamentals. This is a rendering of what the Kleiss Tavern space looks like currently. And some of our renderings are still works in progress. We've just finished our design development phase, so the 3rd out of 4 design phases. And this one was really engaged in a process of thinking about strategy. Where are we going to put screens? That's what the blue boxes are. Where are we going to put didactic panels where you have things like writing and images? Those are the yellow panels. Where do we put furnishings? Where do we put artifacts? But when you walk into this first floor, first you're going to be introduced to the center and the messages itself. You're going to walk further into the next room, which I'll show in a second, and be introduced to the history of Lancaster County. You'll be introduced to Thaddeus Stevens, the man, and you'll be introduced to Lydia Smith. And in doing that, we'll create a context that will help really provide a foundation for the experiences you'll have throughout the rest of the center. So I just have a couple of renderings that sort of show you the process that we're engaged in right now. This is as we start thinking about what stories go where. It's almost like if we're scripting and we're creating architectural designs at the same time, you kind of imagine how the story mapping begins to flow. What story goes where, which wall, which artifact, in which space do we want to use a media treatment so that we can tell a story somewhat succinctly. So here in the Kleist Tavern, which is our first big key experience, we're going to really quickly set the stage on what Lancaster County is like in the 1840s and 50s. And while we will give a broad stroke that helps you understand the context of the county as a whole, because certainly the Underground Railroad network that is scattered throughout the community will feed into a lot of the stories, we're also really going to hone in on the neighborhood itself. So understanding the nuances of who is living and working and interacting with Stevens and Smith in sort of a floor block radius actually paints a very full picture of what this community looked like in all of its complexities. Once you've understood this place that Stevens is moving into and Smith is as well, we're going to take you into the law office, what it currently looks like, and sort of recreate. There will be a few places throughout the center where we really will do as full of a restoration as we possibly can so that you have that sense of place. You'll be able to kind of associate the people with the stories that we're telling. It will feel a little bit like Thaddeus Stevens just walked out of the room. He's on his way over to Central Market. But we also recognize this is not a traditional house history museum, as so many are. Buchanan's home, Wheatland, is a perfect example. And so there'll be an interplay of these recreations and this use of the authentic material, which we very much want to highlight, with opportunities to have displays, media, panels, so that you can get the explanatory component delivered to you. And you'll see throughout these renderings, again, these are more sort of the affordances that we're really working to have for accessibility. So in each room, there'll be an introductory panel that will also have an extended platform with a Braille tactile map of the room and the floor plan, so you can come in and understand where everything might be, and a repetition of the written material in Braille. And then from there, anything else that's provided in Braille will be through these tactile QR codes or through other devices. But it at least provides an orientation as you come into each space. After you leave the law office, and in that law office, we're really going to, Tom talked a lot about the key stories that are important to the story of Stephen's life. Some of those will unfold in the law office, some will unfold in different spaces throughout. But in the parlor, this is your first moment to truly meet Mrs. Smith and also start to understand the intersection of their lives in a public sphere. So there's this really interesting interplay between public and private when you are talking about two people. They're not married, they're incredibly close. We're not actually going to answer the question as to whether or not they were in a romantic partnership, because frankly, it doesn't change the story. They were incredibly important to one another. Whether or not they're sleeping together really doesn't matter to us. But they are doing incredible work together, and in these parlors, which are such public spaces, there are stories to tell about the machinations of setting the stage for dinners, for political conversations, for legal trials. What's happening when Smith is negotiating these contracts for properties that she's buying? Is Stevens in the room? I mean, there are these really interesting and intimate stories that we can tell in, I think, particularly these parlor rooms. The other opportunity in the parlor is to create really the first of two very affect-oriented, media-driven experiences. By no means do we want this to be a Disney-ish history experience. But there is a way to get to people through their emotional intake as much as their intellectual one. And we think in having a couple of standout moments where we have an immersive media opportunity, that's a really great storytelling device. In the museum world, we tend to talk about the three categories of visitors. They're the studiers, the streakers, and the strollers. You can all choose which one of those you are. The streakers are keeping their clothes on, but they're going very fast through a museum. And they're the ones who are going to be grateful that scattered throughout this space, we have some media so that you can take a lot of heady information in relatively quickly. So now you've been oriented to everything you really need to know as a foundation of Stevens and Smith's life. And we're going to take you downstairs and use the space as it is now, and really start to pull apart the thread of abolitionist activity and anti-slavery activity in Lancaster County. We'll introduce you, these renderings right now still have a degree of kind of national figures, abolitionists. We're going to try and really bring local characters in as much as we can into this space so that you can understand who is doing what work in this community. We have 3 galleries in the basement level, the cellar level of Stephen's home, where we'll talk about freedom and slavery in the North, unpack a lot of mythology, explain a lot of the details about why this was such a challenged and challenging environment. It was pretty hotly contested, and this was not a safe place to live. Even though we are a free state after 1851, when the Fugitive Slave Act is passed in 1850, if you're a formerly enslaved person living in Pennsylvania or a free person of color, you're at risk for kidnapping. And so being in a border community is complicated. There's going to be a lot that we try and tell through the artifacts we have in our collection and the stories that are based here in Lancaster. The remarkable story of the Christiana resistance in 1851. If we have another hour, I'll tell you all of that one. Once you've left kind of this pretty sizable overview of all of activity, this is our second big media experience. This will be in the basement level of the Kleist Tavern. We'll probably try and begin telling the story of Stephen's involvement in the Civil War, of what the war years were like here in Lancaster County and in Pennsylvania. And then we're going to move you through a couple of spaces we don't have renderings of, where you really start to understand the evolution from the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 straight to the 13th Amendment 2 years later, and why it was important to have an amendment. The Emancipation Proclamation did not do what the amendment did. And so what we need to do is try and explain as succinctly and simply as possible to folks the complexities of this really crucial moment in our history. We'll keep going through this basement level, through the end of the war, through Reconstruction, through Stephen's involvement in all the activities Tom mentioned. And then we're going to have this great opportunity. The convention center space below Commons on Vine lobby has this wonderful, almost 10,000 square foot spot where we can talk about these 3 constitutional amendments and their significance, not just in the moment when they were formed, but their significance to us today. Do a lot more to dissect what the legacy of Reconstruction means for us today, and talk in part about ongoing freedom struggles, ways through the civil rights movement and beyond that these amendments have stayed with us and why they're significant. Upstairs, we have a few other rooms we get to use to tell the story more in depth about Mrs. Smith, the intersection of their private lives, what their legacies were like after each of their deaths, how the media treated both Smith and Stevens in the intervening century. Another hour, I can go on about that one as well. But we will have the chance to create community space and educational programming space. So the Kleist Tavern has 2 wonderful rooms above the 2nd and 3rd floor where we can really imagine doing community gathering, educational programs, school programs. There are 14 schools in walking distance of this center. There are 6,200 8th graders within a 20-mile driving radius. We can reach so many young people in this center and have space created specifically for their needs. And then on the 3rd floor, we're imagining something that really starts to intersect community activities that don't yet exist. So a place to have community archaeology focused. Jim Dell, who did the excavation of this center, who's at Millersville, would love to see the opportunity to create a hub for other urban archaeology projects, particularly in communities of color, to start telling stories we just don't have. So, you might want to chime in on this one. What does this mean for us as a community, other than great history and hopefully great tourism? Museums actually, I don't have this statistic up there, but museums attract more visitors on an annual basis than every amusement park and sporting event combined. Museums are a powerful economic driver. Museums have the capacity to extend the economic impact well beyond a little corner of our own space, like the corner of Queen and Vine, to the broader community. We're working already very closely with the Convention Center. A lot of our partners, Southern Market is going to be an amazing asset to have directly across the street from this. But trying to figure out ways where the money that is being spent, they're going to spend $15 on our ticketing and maybe some money in the retail store. But if every visitor spends $328, which is the tourist average for a museum goer, over 5 years' time, they're going to spend a lot of money in Lancaster County. I like that second statistic the most. You want to add anything in here? I'm rambling.
I would just add that museums also have the reputation of being one of the most trusted sources for information among the public. So where you may be questioning what you're reading in the newspaper or what you're seeing on television, in survey after survey, Americans tell the surveyors, we trust what we find in museums. So that's a great advantage to have. Can we sustain that? I hope so. We certainly intend to.
And just so you wonder, I'm sure, how are we going to pull this off? Diana said over $20 million capital campaign. We think it's actually going to be close to $24 million. We're over halfway there. That's the good news. And why is this so expensive? It would be cheaper if we were building it from scratch. The fact that we have to work within the confines of 2 historic spaces and a pre-existing integral spot within a convention center is complicated. In some ways, there's something akin to working on a hospital as there is to this, because we're going to have a noise-free, dust-free zone while also a construction project, because we're going to be inside a convention center that will be functional. We also have, in that $24 million total, a $5 million endowment sustainability fund. The last thing we want to do is create another museum that doesn't have support already built into the long-term plan. We've conducted a business sustainability plan.
Yeah, let me say a word about that. Jim Hartling from University of Pennsylvania has a business side to his work, which is called Urban Partners. Jim has worked with a number of institutions in Lancaster County and in central Pennsylvania, and what he did for us when we merged with Wheatland in 2009 was a pro forma for 5 or 6 years going forward, looking at all the money in and all the money out to demonstrate for ourselves and to the community that this is a sustainable enterprise. And so we asked Jim to do the same thing for us, and we pleaded with him to be very conservative on his estimates for income and very aggressive on his estimates for expenses. And so we're pretty confident that we've got a framework going out at least 5 years that demonstrates sustainability for the project. Yeah.
So we'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to take your questions.
You guys want to take a seat? I can pop
Sure.
on the background. Actually, yeah, take this one. Run this around. So now I know the first thing to ask someone before you go to a museum. Are you a studier, a streaker, or a stroller? Yeah. Make sure you partner well with people.
Compatibility is key.
Do we have any questions for Tom and Robin? That was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
I have a question, because we talk a lot about Stevens and Smith together and all their relationship, whatever it was. Is there much written word of them communicating to each other? Are there times where she's responding to what he's trying to get done, or vice versa?
So we wish we had this fantastic trove of letters between the two of them, you know, John and Abigail Adams style. We have a couple. There are probably 12 remnant letters from Lydia Smith. Most of them that we have are actually from Lydia Smith to his nephews, talking about their uncle. So there's a very familial connection between Smith and Allenson and Thaddeus Stevens Jr. And she's chastising them from time to time. Hey, you haven't visited your uncle. You need to get down here. Your uncle's not well. And it's a very intimate connection. You can tell she is close to these two young men. There are also a number of correspondences between Stevens and other people that reference Lydia Smith, and in every single instance, she's referred to as Mrs. Smith. There's a degree of respect and also familial connection. So it's always, there are young women, I don't know if it's Dr. Carpenter's daughters, it's the daughters of another associate, and they'll write Thaddeus Stevens, and please give our love to Mrs. Smith, is the sort of thing in court.
And they're two of the people that she leaves a bequest to. There's 2 young girls that live just across the street. There was another thought I had about not letters. It'll come back. Other questions, though?
Let me run over here to Molly.
Oh, I know what it was. When Stevens, before Stevens dies, he tells his associate, in the presence of Mrs. Smith, I have not provided sufficiently for her in my estate plan. And he doubles the amount that he wants left to her. Instead of $5,000, $10,000. But it never gets written into the will, and she is denied the money, so she sues the estate. And all of the high and mighty that she has interacted with are brought before the court. They're deposed, and all of these depositions about her and her care for him and her dedication to him and to the community survive in the Lancaster County Archives. And they become the grist for this new biography that will come out. We learned more about Lydia Hamilton Smith because of her challenging, through the court system, the estate than we probably ever would have known about her.
Lawyers write things down, don't they, Sam?
Fortunately.
Yeah, Molly Krauser, Lancaster Chamber. There's a close relationship, time-wise, between James Buchanan, Ed Wheatland, and Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith. What's it going to look like from a museum perspective or organizational perspective to have that relationship between the two sites?
It's like we planted her, but we didn't. Molly and I did a podcast on this topic, though. So it's pretty fascinating. When you think about, from an historical perspective, how lucky we are that two of the key figures in American politics in mid-19th century America and the Civil War years lived a mile and a half away from each other in Lancaster. So and they are on opposite ends of the political spectrum. So there are a lot of things to talk about and compare and contrast. We have quite a few. Our collection of Buchanan artifacts is remarkable. We actually have a sizable one of Stevens, but we have a number of artifacts that really help tell the story of Buchanan's perspective on slavery, and then specifically how they contrast with Stevens. We just purchased
we just purchased a political pamphlet from the when Buchanan's running for president that basically is in support of Fremont and is making the claim that the Democratic Party here is going to basically enslave all the working class in the country, be you black or white. It's a pretty vituperative thing. But you'll see Buchanan at the Stevens and Smith Center because you not only can you not talk about him, we have to talk about the juxtaposition of these two people. And they may have lived a mile and a half apart from each other, but actually Buchanan had a home roughly where New Holland coffee shop is now. So they were around the corner from one another and had to walk past each other on their way to the courthouse, presumably. And interestingly, they both die in the summer of 1868, one in
June, one in August. Stevens is August.
And June, right? Yeah.
And you can't tell, I will not go into all the history of this, you can't tell the story of the 14th Amendment without also telling the story of the Dred Scott decision, which strips citizenship intentionally from black men, from black people, but black men were the ones who were given voting rights prior to that. And anyway, I could go into the details. You can't talk about what follows if you don't talk about what comes before. And the Dred Scott decision is rendered 2 days after Buchanan's inauguration on his watch with his permission. So there's a really interesting arc to follow. There will be points throughout the center that will talk about certainly the political legacy, but also the personal one. I mean, there are some pretty interesting social stories to say.
What is your hopeful timeline?
Well, Thaddeus Stevens' birthday is April 4th, and 2025 seems like a really, April 4th, 2025. Mark your calendars. It's a Friday. Yeah. The convention center is holding it for us.
Jeff?
The quote earlier about Thaddeus Stevens was not known to Lancaster County is sort of intriguing because I grew up in Lancaster, and I think until the film Lincoln, I wasn't even aware that he had Lancaster County ties. So this project is exciting in that regard. So I guess I don't know, either comment or a question. So why do you think historically that has been, and now you're really rising this man up to the significance of who he was? I know we have a Thaddeus Stevens Bridge because every time I run across it, I stop and read the placard there. And then the striking thing that you attested to is he was a Republican. And so maybe that's something this project can work towards some unity in Lancaster County?
So I want to take your question and flip it around a little bit. If you were to have asked any white citizen of Lancaster County over the last 50 years, tell me what you know about Thaddeus Stevens, you might have gotten a blank stare from some. You'd find some that knew about him, especially if they're in the legal profession, they know about him. If you asked a black Lancastrian who is Thaddeus Stevens, you would get the full-on story. Because from the late 18th century, late 19th century, right through the 1950s, there'd be an annual pilgrimage from black churches to the gravesite to honor the memory of Stevens. So there is this bifurcation of memory in the community. Now, at the same time in the 1930s, when we're preserving Mr. Buchanan's home, no one really knows what's going on down here at Stevens' home, and frankly, most people probably didn't care. the why is a tough one to really get at. I think it's complicated. You look at the newspapers from the 1850s and 1860s, and Ernie, I'd love to have you expound on this because I know you've looked at all of these. You get both sides of this of the arguments on all of the hot political issues. So Lancaster County had folks who were staunchly in support of the positions Buchanan was taking and adamantly in support of the positions that Stevens was taking. And you see those represented usually in different newspapers. So it's complicated.
I think to your second point of your question, is there an opportunity at the center to sort of bring people together with differing views? The answer is fundamentally yes. This is an interesting story that you can tell that's complicated and complex, but they can help lead people down a path of thinking how we engage in civil discourse, how we engage in civil debate. Stevens was known for some zingers, but he was also the king of compromise in a number of ways, really understood the value of working together to get things done. The Southerners might not agree with him, agree with that statement about him, but he recognized that through compromise he could move the needle forward on what he saw as the most important issues of the day.
Pat Levin.
As a genealogist and a historian, have you been able to find contemporary descendants of both of these individuals?
Only collateral descendants of Stevens. And I don't know of any descendants that we have found of Smith. But great question, and wouldn't. Yeah.
The problem for Smith's descendants is that she had two sons, one who died in 1860, and her son Isaac died just after she did, about 4 months later. And neither that we know of had at least legal children. So tracing their descendants is almost impossible.
I think Ernie did want to follow.
Yeah, just a brief comment. Stevens was well known throughout the county, up until the Depression. The Republican Party was of like mind with Thaddeus Stevens through the congressmen that followed Stevens, particularly William Walton Grist, who was the longest serving congressman in Lancaster County history. 11 terms, 22 years. Something happened, and it's a great question for research, after the Depression, during World War II, where Stevens was forgotten and the community political milieu flipped. Yeah.
And you also have The Birth of a Nation. Really the first blockbuster film to come out, which vilifies Stevens in no uncertain terms, as well as Smith. And that's the steady diet that certainly the South is getting, but the North is getting it too. It was to have played at the Fulton Theater, but for Mr. Grist, who through his machinations made sure it did not play at the Fulton Theater. Instead, it went to Columbia. And folks went to Columbia to see it. So there are the power of the word, the power of media certainly plays a role here in how people are remembered or misremembered. Yeah.
Diana said I had to introduce, excuse me, had to introduce myself. So I'm Brian Davis with Hourglass. Thanks for presenting. One story that you touched on was the border state concept. And I had never really thought about that and how what that would have been like living here at that time for everyone, and the whole bounty hunter thing. So maybe, as you think through it, to add a little excitement to the museum, that could be a part of the history that would really be fun to.
It will be a big part of our content in the section that I mentioned. I started going a little quickly when I looked at the clock.
Tell the story about the Prothonotary quickly.
All right, so on the square, so within stone's throw of where we are right now. So the reason why it's so fraught is we're 16, 17 miles away from the Mason-Dixon line, and Maryland is a substantial slave state. So people who are arriving in Pennsylvania seeking freedom, thinking they've finally arrived somewhere that's safe, really are not far from a threat. And Tom read the quote about I have a spy on the spies. So at 8 West King Street, which I think is actually the former offices of L&P, there was a man who had an office, a desk job as a bounty hunter. And he would receive these dispatches from Maryland of people who had escaped or left of their own devices. They made their way to Lancaster County, and Marylanders would hear about this through their spies and send notes to this guy whose job was to go and retrieve them and put them in jail because the Fugitive Slave Act made that legal, and then send them back into enslavement. Well, this same guy was illiterate, and so he needed assistance reading a lot of these dispatches and would go to the Prothonotary up at the courthouse to have them read. Well, the Prothonotary is in Stevens' network. Stevens is getting word of this, and hence this circle of the spies on the spies starts to come closed. But this is a huge national story about what's evolving in our country in the 1850s, and it's happening right there.
On that block, from Vine Street to the center square.
Right? Yeah.
We had spies on spies here in Lancaster.
Yes,
so, is there going to be any beer in the tavern? No one asked the most important question.
On occasion,
Have you met
absolutely.
us, Diana? Yes.
Thank you so much, Tom and Ryan, Tom, Ryan, and Robin for being here. We really got this fresh information. Robin just sent me the slides. Some of this was just mocked up yesterday. So this is really the most up-to-date. It's an evolving project, and excited to stay in the loop as we come towards 2025. So thank you so much for being here. And we do have a video recording of this, so that'll be on our website and YouTube channel. So please feel free to share it with other folks in the community. Could you hit the next slide for me, please? I just wanted to let you guys know that we take the month of July off for our First Friday forums. So our next First Friday forum will not be, we'll be back here on August 4th. So everyone have a nice picnic in July. But I did want to invite you all. We are hosting an event back here at the Ware Center this Tuesday, June 6th, 5 to 7 p.m. If you're here, you're interested in the topic of democracy, this is an event we're hosting in partnership with the City of Lancaster and the Bloomberg Center for Public Innovation at Johns Hopkins, and it's all about community engagement, how just voting is not enough, right, to make a democracy work. There's a lot more after we cast that vote. So this will be a free event. We'll have a nice reception. You can grab tickets to it, a free ticket for it on our website at hourglasslancaster.org. So I really hope to see you there. And until then, have a great weekend. Thanks.